welcome to this webinar. My name is Neil Collins. I run the governance business unit at the Key, so that includes GovernorHub and Key for School Governors. And I've been looking forward to this chat for a while. So please welcome Vic Goddard. Many of you will recognise his face. Vic, tell us what you do and how you got to what you're currently doing.
Okay. Hi, I'm Vic. I'm currently the co-principal of Passmores Academy in Harlow, along with a colleague, Natalie, who's fantastic. Because on the side of that, I'm also the CEO of our trust of 4 schools, which is Passmores as a secondary school and 3 local walking distance primary schools. So I'll be honest, never intended to be a CEO of a trust of 4 schools, was never really on any plans. Even when the governors decided to become an academy, that was never really what we thought of. But we were approached by local schools and who were feeling vulnerable, I think, post Ofsted and just with what was the sort of the general feeling around academisation at the time. And so they had approached us and said, look, would you consider being a sponsor? So we went from a single academy trust to suddenly being a trust of 4 schools. But and I know lots of heads sort of then take on the CEO role and go down that route. But I the best part of my job is still the children, and so I didn't want to be. And I'm sure there were brilliant CEOs out there who managed to be in the schools all the time and be with children all the time. But I'm not certain I'm that brilliant. So I wanted to make sure I still had that connection with young people that viewed me as their head and me connected to them, I think. So that was that's where the last few bits. But prior to that, PE teacher, PE and maths teacher all the way through my career. Got my degree in Chichester on the south coast, had a fantastic 3 years down there, and then sort of did a bit of traveling around the place. Really, I've always had a career plan from becoming an NQT. I always knew I wanted to be a head. I'm that sort of person.
Ever since university, or before university?
Before as soon as my teacher training was there, I was like, if I'm going to be a teacher, I want to be a head teacher, because that's the pinnacle of the job as far as I was concerned. And so I left school.
I don't think that's that common. I don't think that's that common. A lot of teachers don't want to be heads.
Yeah, I think it's less common now. I guess for me, I'm fortunate. I'm 10 years younger than my eldest brother, and he was the first boy to go to university from my school, and went on to be a teacher. And then my next brother followed to be a teacher, and my sister followed to be a teacher. So I sort of knew the teaching bit, but I always knew that wasn't going to be enough for me. I also knew, being a PE teacher, that at some point I'd be too old, too fat, or have bad knees, that I needed to do something else. and all of those things happened. So
welcome to the club. So what were your parents teachers as well then? Or
Mum worked in the civil service up until giving birth to my brother, and then didn't work until I went to school, really, and then was a dinner lady, and then went back into the civil service. My dad was a plumber. And council estate in South London. So it very much wasn't in the DNA of our family to be teachers. However, the investment my parents put into our schooling and just turning up to everything and supporting us in anything we wanted to do meant school was really important to us, and it came from them without a doubt.
Were either of your parents governors?
Yes, so my dad ended up being chair of governors of my school, my secondary school, and that was a strange thing, because it was a very traditional all boys school in South London, and you had to stand up when the chair of governors walked into the room and stuff like that. And so that was a bit strange. That was a bit strange, but I ended up sort of that route because that's what I wanted to do. I left jobs, sad to leave them, but it was for the next step.
And was it your first headship was at Passmores? So you must have been head there. How long have you been head?
11 years now, I think. Yeah, 11 years. So I went to Passmores as assistant head. So I myself and my wife did 3 years working overseas in Cairo, and loved it, and came back, and she got a job in Harlow. I got a job in Harlow, so we bought a house there, and then I met the head teacher of my wife's school, which was Passmores, so she was there first, and then sort of met him, got to know him, and then applied for a job and got an assistant head job there. So I always have to say, because my wife still works at the school with me, that she that she got me the job and not the other way round. That's important that I say that, otherwise she won't talk to me. So she was there first.
So, and well, back in 2014, 2015, you took that step from Harlow to the whole national screen. So that was Educating Essex, which I guess must have been also something of a landmark in your headship time.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually, I'm going to make you feel old. It was 2010-11 is when that was filmed.
Really?
Yeah, it was
Vic, I think we're about the same age. Do you find time flies these days? It does for me.
Ridiculously so. And I'll be honest, when we said yes to doing that, we didn't really know what we were saying yes to, because that wasn't what came out. You know, we were expecting I think the figure they quoted was 98% of filming will be done out of school, because it was about lives and loves of year 11 rather than just school. But it didn't take them long. I remember the producer director coming into my office and going, "Rick, we followed the kids outside of school for a week, and them doing this to the person who's sitting 3 feet away from them doesn't make great telly." I was like, okay, so but what we've seen in school really does. So do you mind if we sort of switch the focus? And all of a sudden the cameras came down from one ball in every minute and were put up around the school, and the filming was happening. So yeah, it was very different to what we expected, but absolutely no regrets for it, and learned a lot about the school, myself, and everything else, I think.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then, fast forwarding a bit, I think we get to, I guess, a significant time in all our lives, really, in terms of the pandemic, lockdown, and that sort of I think brought a lot of challenges to everybody involved in education, but I think particularly to head teachers. And I know this is something that you've reflected on.
I think the challenge that obviously the very sudden nature of it, but all of our decisions obviously are around safeguarding and around keeping children safe. Of course they are, but they still feel one step removed, whereas all of a sudden the decisions we were making were one step removed, and they were very much affecting the real people, real lives. People were dying around us. We knew people were dying in families of young people, and so it just took a whole different feel, I'll be honest.
So did you actually had some of the parents of your pupils at the school die?
Yeah, and members and we had one member of staff die of COVID, and you feel your level of responsibility. Where I was sad for all the deaths, of course it was, but the member of staff who had worked with me throughout my time at the school and was really important to me as a person as well as an employee, obviously. So, and of course, when you question, did he catch it at work? What did any of my decisions contribute to him catching it in the first place? That became overwhelming a little bit, I think.
What overwhelming for you personally?
Yeah, I got to a stage where waking up feeling nauseous and anxious and going to bed feeling exactly the same way is not healthy for anybody. Especially when, and I think this is where I think probably governors who would know their head teachers well, there is a feeling that we shouldn't be burdening other people. It's our job to solve problems. It's our job to make the changes. Yeah. And all of a sudden, those changes had to be done very quickly because we were given such short notice so many times. But the real term impact was something that people had to carry. And so, yeah, my anxieties. It's still there, I guess, in a different way. But it's something that was definitely triggered through the dealing with the pandemic, without a doubt.
And it's not the first time I've heard this. I'm chair of a multi-academy trust, and I could sort of see. I met with my CEO every week by video call, and you could sort of see the tension in his eyes, and it was, I think, like you're saying, it's that reality check. Say, okay, the decisions I'm taking now are even more significant, as a leader of a school or as a MAT, and that was it must weigh heavy.
I think I'll be honest, right? I'm seeing it in the comments coming up on the corner of my screen from people. People are very quick to anger these days. There's been some really not very pleasant comments going up in the corner of the screen from people who've chosen to be at a webinar, and I think there's an element of there's an element of you know, lots of people's tolerances as lessened. You know, people go from 0 to 100 very quickly, and there's you know, you're either right or wrong, and it really felt that when you're in that window, especially through the pandemic, that no matter what decision you made, you weren't right or wrong. There, you know, somebody would tell you were right, somebody would tell you were wrong, and that was a challenge. And for governors who has then lost their connection into the school, you know, weren't visiting, etc., and were only probably seeing their head down, you know, down the computer screen as well, was incredibly difficult for governors and for everybody else, because we all had that highest level of responsibility possible, the level of responsibility about people's lives.
Yeah, and I think that as a trustee, it came out to me. I mean, literally the first time I've been back into the school was the other day, and oh my goodness, I've missed it. And I think there is that connection. You can sort of communicate across video, but you can't necessarily feel that same connection. It's exactly the same way. So, I mean, back in November last year, you wrote a particular blog post about how this had affected you, and how you sort of came to a realization that, you know, this was something you needed to go and get help about. Maybe you can just talk us through that.
I mean, I'm a husband and a dad, and I think, you know, my son was going through his sixth form at the same time as the pandemic was on, and obviously needed his family around him at the same time, and it got to the stage where I just wasn't present at home, and I knew I wasn't, and I think that's something that probably governors will have known for themselves, let alone for other people. But you know, I was at home functioning and just waiting for the next day to start. And that's not healthy. That's not the way I've ever lived. You know, I'm incredibly, the biggest job I have in the world is being a dad. And so to not do that as well as I could, because I was being a dad to other people's children, you know, that started to grate. And, you know, my wife is the most tolerant human on the planet. But her to say, you know, talk to somebody, you know, maybe you should talk to somebody and get some advice. And, you know, I'm a typical, you know, unfortunately, a typical man of head in the sand. Now I'll be all right, you know, and probably took advice a year too long, really. And it may have not been as ingrained as it is and hard to get out of coming out the other side. But for me, I was getting so many phone calls from other heads. You know, I'm fortunate, having done the TV thing, that people reach out to me through social media or other things. And I was hearing so many heads saying how they were feeling, and I was telling them how it affected me as well, because that's who I am. And they were like, "Oh, I feel so much better for you telling me, Vic, thanks." You know, I thought it'd just be me, and so that's why I wrote the blog in the end. You know, the blog was for somebody to say, "Look, I'm feeling this. I don't know who else it is, but if you are, you're not alone." You know. And
I mean, within the profession, do you think head teachers share that sort of thing?
Not. I shared it with the world before I shared it with my staff. I shared it with the world before I shared it with my mum and dad, or my mum.
Really?
And I guess, yeah, and I think that's probably again down to that. My job's to solve problems, not create them. My job's not to make somebody else's life more difficult. It's to make somebody's life better. And so by sharing my burden, I'm creating somebody else who's got something else to carry, not just me, you know, and I should be strong enough and professional enough. And I'm not going to say man enough, because that's a nonsense thing to say, but you know what I mean? I should be adult enough to deal with that, because I'm paid well and that's what I should do. And I think that element of, you know, hiding it from everybody around you, governors, you know, in governors meetings, it's easy when it's online, isn't it? You know, you can stick a blurry background on, a smile on your face, and answer the questions. And I think probably it took for people to look at me and go, "Jesus, Vic, you're grey and you got 90 instead of 70. So, you know, do something about it." But yeah, it's not a natural thing to do, because as somebody who's been created as a leader and got to that point through work they've done, you know, it then felt like a bit of a weakness to say that you needed help.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think of it that way, and I know a lot of the comments, like you, I can sort of see them chipping up, and I think a lot of people are saying that they welcome the honesty that you shared there, you know. Yeah. And it's amazing that you say you wrote it to share it with your parents, because, you know, all of their kids have gone into teaching, haven't they? And that, I mean, you and your siblings are in teaching, and yet still, it was almost difficult to share with them.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the nature of that is, this is obviously aimed at governance such a tough job. I mean, I've been a school governor in a few schools, and my dad was chair of governors as well. But that duty of care that is so strongly felt by governors for their schools, for their communities, and obviously for their head teacher, because that's a member of staff they see the most. That was incredibly difficult, and I think as we come out the other end of that, those stresses are still there. The schools are, and I can only speak for mine, are harder places to manage post-pandemic than they were before. And so there are things that you think, well, is that still a priority? Do I need to spend much time doing that? Because, it's the young people have come back and it's been difficult for them.
So were there particular things that your governors or trustees did or didn't do, perhaps, that, helped during that time?
I'm very fortunate, got really experienced governors and trustees, and that's helpful. People that have known the school and known the community for a long time, and therefore known me, because even though I've been head for 11 years, I've been there 20 years. So it's, I guess, from their perspective, they needed to know that that's what I was struggling with, and they did. I guess that's all I could say. Even though I hadn't verbalized,
they did know.
Yeah, even though I hadn't verbalized how I was feeling, they knew it was tough, and they could see that. So simple things like, if something didn't need to be written up well in advance for them to do it, if it could be something that could be done verbally, they said, just do this verbally. But you don't need to write a report that's going to take you out of reading everything else you've done. Showing some flexibility around, how things are presented. I've for years spent time making my documents lovely, beautiful colours, and readers for the landscape, all that sort of thing. But actually,
specifically for governor meetings?
Yeah, for the governors. Yeah, you create documents, and then you think, well, actually, that reflects on me, so it needs to look right. It needs to look, all those sorts of things. And in the end, you wanted somebody to say, it's okay if you just tell us. We have a clerk. They will record it very well. Just tell us that part. We don't need to know that in advance. Of course, data and all the other things that take time to read and time to digest and come up with questions, that didn't change. But I think it was just the realization, say, Vic, if you need to do this differently at the moment, that's okay, and that made a big difference.
Although actually that sort of advice isn't bad advice, even out of lockdown, even out of these situations. I think head teachers producing reports for governors which they are using in school, if they're spending extra time, particularly the sort of prettification of reports, my goodness, I think that's such a drain on time.
But there is a competitive, you look at the, whatever you want to call it, academisation, but the marketisation of some aspects of school life has meant that, there's a competition out there. It's competition to be seen as the shiny school that's going to, be given more schools and grow and that sort of thing. And actually for the governors to say, enough of that, just focus on doing the things that we know you care about and do well, and other stuff that we don't need to know in advance, don't worry about, was just such a relief. Even down to things like appraisal is incredibly emotionally challenging, I think, for heads, because you really are having a very in-depth conversation around your own performance, and that, and quite rightly, it's forensic, and it should be. But even down to that, saying, okay, we know you've got to produce paperwork for this because you need to. Is now the best time for that? Or, are you happy that we push it back 2 weeks, or would you prefer it now? Because sometimes pushing meetings back is the worst thing possible to do, because you want it out of the way. You want to get that piece of work done so you can focus on the next piece of work. Mm-hmm. So just cancelling things or just saying, look, we'll push that back without removing it doesn't necessarily help. And that was, my governors and trustees were really sort of responsive on that for me. So is now the right time, or is it 2 weeks the right time, Vic? And I didn't feel obliged one way or the other.
So, and how did that conversation work? Did you sort of say to the governors or the trustees, actually, can you back off? Or was it them coming to you saying, Vic, you look really stressed, can we take stuff off you? Which way around did the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I had that. The relationship with the chair is obviously the most vital one as a head, and as CEO, and in the CEO role. So the chair of my trust was, and in fact, the chair and the vice chair both did phenomenal work around that for me, and were just drop me a text. Didn't need to be a proper conversation. How are things? Just staying in touch. Meeting coming up in a couple of weeks. Is it the right one? They preempted those things for me. But that comes down to having a really honest relationship with your chair. When I first became head, I was rubbish at governance stuff. I was awful. I was arrogant. I was dismissive. But it was too much of a burden.
As a head teacher,
I was awful.
Arrogant.
I was awful. I was awful because actually, I went in going, well, what do you know more than I know? That was underlying. Why am I having to justify myself to people who aren't in the school, who actually can't do the job better than I can? And my chair of governors was awesome. He phoned me up and invited me to his house for a cup of tea, which never happened.
So you thought, well, this is either going to be great or I'm in trouble.
Yes, one or the other. I was having from the sack or from a pay rise. And he just sat me down and said, Vic, we employed you because how your relationships with people, how you manage the staff and the students, you're not managing your relationship with us. If things are getting in the way, if you aren't able to do your job because of things we're asking you to do, that's not what we want to do. So talk to me and tell me which bits are a waste of your time and which bits aren't. But don't ever dismiss the voice of the community and those people that can give you that input, because at some point you'll need us back, Vic. And he, of course, was very right. That very quickly I needed their support. So I think having a really open and honest relationship with my chair was such a strength at the start of my headship. That sort of set the tone for me, and it meant then from that point forward we could continue to be honest.
Yeah, I've not been in that seat, but I've been in the other one as a chair of governors, and I think that relationship is so important between the chair and the head, so that you can have those honesty when stuff happens, like that your head teacher is looking suddenly really stressed. You can say, what's the matter, and they will actually give you an answer. It's so important. I think it's and during lockdown, how did the relationship with your chair change? How did it work?
Did it change? No, I think his empathy valve was turned up to full. I think that during those, especially those early stages where the guidance was changing on a daily basis, no remote, etc., all of those sorts of things. The way that he would just sort of, the open, everything all right sort of question, and not filling the space when I was too busy thinking about what was all right and what wasn't. That helped. The skill. I needed to be listened to during that moment. Do you know what I mean? I needed to be listened to. I needed somebody to go, this is what I'm dealing with. This is the decisions I made. I think I've made the right one. I'm not asking you to validate my decision, but I just need you to know the process I'm going through. And I think he probably listened to me more than ever. And that was what was needed. I just needed somebody to hear my woes or my joy, and allow me to help process that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that sort of getting your ideas, getting things off your chest sometimes. Is that how it sort of felt?
Yeah, I think the problem is that, obviously in my position, I've got a co-principal. So I've got somebody at the same level of me that I can now share that conversation with, who's got just as much responsibility. But in most schools, the head teacher has only got people hierarchically below them. Yeah. So, I'm not going to share my woes with my deputy head, who's also got their own woes. And let's be honest, in most places, the deputy heads are busy running the school while the head teacher's doing other stuff. And I think that element of, well, who do I speak to that I'm not burdening? And I think I needed to be convinced that was my chair of governors, and it was. So
you've probably got quite a lot of chairs of governors listening to you right now. What would your sort of key advice be for them if they don't think they've got that sort of open relationship with their head? What would you say to them? How should they get it?
Yeah, and that's really easy to say. Time is always easy to say, isn't it? It's always. But I do think actually we all listen, but it's hearing as well. That real active listening that good coaches have. There's an element of, I think every chair of governors needs to be the best coach they can possibly be, because I'm not asking for answers. head teachers generally don't come to chairs of governors to give them an answer. They generally come to them when they've got nobody else to talk to, or there's something they need to think through, and they need somebody hierarchically equal or higher. And for me, that knowing that there were times when he would just listen and not give me any answers and just say, okay, what are you doing next and how are you feeling? That's all I needed. So I think, I don't know how much training chairs of governors generally get about coaching through you guys or through anybody else. But for me, he was my coach through that. He never gave me answers, but he just listened and pointed me in the right direction and gave me a little stick if I needed it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the answer to that in terms of the sort of training that governors get when they take on the chair is quite a lot when it comes to what you have to do, what your responsibilities are. Here's the statutory guidance. This is you now have to do these things. I think it's incredibly hard to coach those softer skills. I mean, I think some of the people I've learned most from in governance have been experienced chairs, and I've just talked to them, and they've sort of shared their experiences and how things work. I think, oh yes, okay, I can see that, and I think that's really important. But in terms of those teaching those soft skills, very hard.
Yeah, and I've seen really awful coaching by teachers who've been trained in coaching. And all they're ever waiting for is the person they're listening to pause long enough for breath so they can fill in the gap and tell them what they should do. And no relationship with a head teacher who, by default, we have an ego because we've pushed ourselves and decided that we should be applying for the head job. So there's always an element of ego involved with being a head teacher. And I think, therefore, for somebody to come and say, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, is never going to work as a good long-term relationship. It's to do with, okay, what's our joint aims? What's our joint focus, be that skill, vision or mission or whatever? Okay, what are we going to do to achieve that? What do you need from me, Vic? What I needed was somebody to make sure that, the plate gets re-spun about important things. What's important to the school remains important to the school, no matter if we're going through a pandemic or not. And it's important that my chair of governors and the rest of the governing body keep that in mind. Yeah, we're coping with a pandemic, but the bottom line is we're also doing this because that's what we always do every day. So let's make sure that that what's important stays important.
And what about when it does get too hard? That the mental health of the head is suffering, it's going down. What do you think the role of the governors, chair of governors should be then?
Yeah, do you know what? So the well-being is an interesting one, isn't it? Because we have lots of schools and lots of governors and lots of heads who make well-being decisions on behalf of other people and decide that their work-life balance isn't correct and, they should go and do some yoga or whatever. The reality is that's not what I needed, and that's what I don't think anybody needs. There's nothing worse than forced well-being because it makes me very angry. So from that perspective, it's actually listening to the head and saying, okay, this is, how is your work-life balance? And when they say it's fine, okay, what does that mean? What does your work, what is a good balance for you? Let me ask you that as the chair. Tell me how it works, because for me, my work-life balance has always been fairly structured in the fact that I would spend time with my family when I came back from school, and then when my wife loves to sleep, so when she goes to bed, I would then do my 2 hours work, and so I'd have family life and work life. But I love my work, so I never felt like I was forcing myself to work between 9 and 11. I did it because I loved it. I read education books because I love reading them. For somebody to say, take a break, I don't want to take a break. I enjoy that. So for somebody to force me to not do something, even though I enjoy doing it, that doesn't make sense. So again, it is listening. The biggest skill governors and trustees have is to listen, and not just listen to what's being said, listen to what's not being said as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think so many head teachers, maybe because of the ego, maybe because they're pointing their career, but they are driven people. I don't think I've ever met a head teacher or a CEO that isn't fundamentally driven by some inner energy that pushes them on. And I think that very quickly slips into overwork. And then when there's anxiety, I think you talked in your blog about sort of the leaky bucket, and there was just more coming in the top than was going out the bottom, and it just overwhelmed. And I think that's a situation that's probably all too common.
There's a head and a CEO of a group of schools in Barnsley called Dave Whitaker. He came and spoke to staff about student behaviour, actually. And what he said was that for some young people, they come to school and their glass is only half full. So if something gets dropped into it, if something, happens in the day, it gets dropped into it, there's still room for the water to rise. It doesn't overflow, but the other young people come in with their glass already full. And so if anything changes on the school day, if any little pebble is dropped into it, it overflows. And I think that's one of the really key things is, during that 2-year period, my capacity was 0. My glass was full every day. There was no room for somebody to drop something else into it. But of course, that happened regularly, didn't it? So the overflow of emotions comes from that. And then the overwhelming feeling of, can I do this? Am I letting people down? So I guess it's trying to find triggers for your heads that, well, how full is their glass? How close to overflowing are they? And again, that comes down to conversations and listening.
So sort of winding back, because you were saying you probably went to the GP maybe a year later than you probably should have done. What is there stuff you wish you or governors had done sooner in the situation? I don't think the governors could have done anything else because they weren't all governors and trustees were more removed during the pandemic than they were before and after. So I know there's no fault that they didn't look after me or I got to that position because they weren't interested. It was just about honesty. It's about not feeling that I'm Superman. That your pants are very much under your trousers, and that's where they should stay. And the days of the superhero head, I can solve the world and I can be everything. That's just, it's unhealthy. It's unsafe. Having that much power in one person, and I just don't think any of that makes sense. And that's why, the role of governors is so vital for me as a head, in the fact that they do make me stop, think, and reflect on what are we doing? Is it having an impact? And it comes back to high quality coaching from people who don't want to give you an answer. And I think governors have to park their ego at the door. There are probably many of my governors who probably have better experience in dealing with some of the stuff than I do. Then you've got governors in finance, you've got governors in legal, etc. Yeah. But I don't ever feel they come to me and say, "I'll tell you what to do, Vic." If I reach out and ask, they will give that to me. But it's not something that they think that they should be demanding to give me the answer. If you do this, it will work. Well, actually, I need to work that out for myself. I don't blame them in any way. I just think I wish I'd been able to be more honest earlier. Honest with governors, yourself?
With governors, but I think everybody really. I think certainly from my perspective, I knew how I felt sitting at the kitchen table, till 2 a.m. trying to work out what happened next. I know how that felt. I know how tired I felt when I woke up. But I hid that from everybody else at the time because I didn't want to burden anybody. And I think for heads to understand that, I think we all feel a bit of guilt toward governors and trustees, if I'm honest. I certainly do, because they give up so much time and they commit so much energy with no pay, with very scant thanks. Generally, you look at the pandemic and how many times were governors thanked by the government, or schools leadership in a wider scale, hardly ever. So, it's difficult to work that through when you're in the middle of something. And I think for governors just to be out, because they are that step removed and can ask the question about certain things to make you think differently. The skill of questioning is so vital.
It's funny you say that, actually, because one of the things that trustees and governors often reflect on is that they also have a feeling of guilt about it. Maybe this is basically fundamentally an unhealthy relationship, I'm not sure. But there's that feeling of guilt about, when I see a really well-presented report that head teachers clearly put time effort, oh my goodness, I've put you to effort just to present information to me. If I just understood this a bit better, you could probably have done this quicker, less time. I think there's
I think you're right, Neil. I think it's a two-way guilt thing. I'm very aware that I don't want to burden my governors, and my governors are very aware that they probably don't want to ask too many questions that create more work. So I think that needs to be honest. I think the plan a plan at the start of the year about what governors and trustees are looking at. I know lots of most governing bodies probably do that. What's our governance plan for the year? What are we asking from the school? Obviously, things need to be fluid, but that upfront sort of decision making, which then allows me to balance my own work throughout for slightly longer, is incredibly helpful. Because I don't want to go back to them and go, oh, sorry, I can't do that, I haven't got time. And that's, so what will I do instead? Well, I'll work myself to death to meet it. And yeah, I again, two-way conversations, but governors are there because they've given up their time voluntarily, so they understand there's a commitment to it. But I can't help having guilt towards the amount of time and effort I expect of them.
Yeah, and I think I don't think I've ever met a governor that really didn't fundamentally care. They wouldn't be around the table if they didn't care about their school, their kids' education. I think that's really true. What about the other one in the equation, the parents? How did that go during lockdown? Was that an aspect of the pressures on you? Did they sort of take a backward step?
31 legal threats, 3 death threats during lockdown. So
3 death threats from parents?
Yeah. Or people alluding to be parents, whether you knew they were parents or not, you don't know, because obviously never brave enough to put their name on the bottom. So, you go near my child, I know where you live, I'll come and find you and kill you. And, that's because unfortunately where I work is quite a divided environment. It's incredibly white and working class in some ways. I have a Conservative MP. So there's there's a tension naturally within there's a tension sort of naturally within the community anyway. But I think what happened during lockdown is all people in authority were removed from families' lives. They weren't going to work probably, so they didn't have a boss. They weren't, interacting with people. So who's an authority figure that they could access? Head teachers generally. Because we were all answering, we were all present, we were all, very reactive to our communities. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety played out in schools. I think probably governors will have had probably more complaints I don't know what sort of surveys you've had, but I know certainly it felt like there's more people, not happy coming out of it. I think the young people's behaviour has been more challenging. And so therefore you have more challenging conversations with families. I think anxiety has been a huge aspect for young people coming back in. The volume of self-harming that's happening in my school is massive compared to where it used to be. Eating disorders, I think I heard a sort of statistic, it's about 58% increase in eating disorders amongst children, of which 51% of them are boys. So they're struggling as well. And I think there's tension throughout it. And so relationships with families, I would say, is probably stronger than it's ever been with the majority, but as divided as it's ever been with a minority.
Wow. And then you were saying, did you say you got legal threats as well?
Yeah,
was that again
lots of lawyers,
parents?
Lots of lawyers' letters. Yeah, lots of lawyers' letters from people around masks, around obviously vaccinations. I'm I'm in breach of the Magna Carta. All sorts of things. Also, pictures of crusaders on the front talking about different things. I think there's, I get people's anxiety gets played out in different ways, but I think when everything else is removed and all they've got left is school to go at, then they have, I think at times. Don't get me wrong, I've had amazing support from the vast majority, but there's not many of us who remember those. We always remember the negatives, unfortunately, because that's who we are, and we want to meet the needs. So you only ever remember those ones and forget the good ones.
But even though some of those you can sort of take with a pinch of salt, they must all hit you. They must all have quite an impact. I think the impact is sort of when you go, what more do you want from me? I understand that we have differences of opinion, but because I have a different opinion to you, maybe about vaccinations or masks, doesn't make me an evil person. It doesn't mean I'm trying to harm anybody. I'm doing the opposite of that. And I think we see Facebook, I think Facebook has been a poisonous place for a very long time. And unfortunately, Facebook now isn't contained on the pages of Facebook. And that's something that, schools have got to manage and governors have to manage. And I think,
I think a big role for me is that when governors say, look, but you don't need to take that, I'll deal with that. Pass that parent to me, please. And that's been helpful at times. Very rarely, but that has been helpful at times, saying that this we can see they're going at you and they think this is about you, but it's not. It's about us. We're a leadership group. So let me take that on as well. That was very rare, but helpful. And of course, I'm sure you can guess what happens, Neil, when that happens. They back right off. The keyboard warrior is not so brave in person. And so that, having governors that are strong enough and brave enough to take that on was incredibly helpful.
That's interesting. Are you seeing any similar sort of anxieties now with the war in Ukraine? I think that's very difficult for some schools and some families.
It's interesting that, isn't it? So we don't have a PTA, we have a friends committee. So my friends at Passmores chair came to see me today and asked about, can we do something about Ukraine and raise some money, etc. We have Russian children in the school, and they're anxious about how they're perceived, and how they will be perceived. So from that angle, I was like, straight away, hold on, we need to make sure that if we're going to do something, it's focused on children and making sure that it's not a comment on war. The fact is that we can see that children are affected and they need support. So as a school, that's what we do. But that balance for just automatically thinking everybody's going to agree with you that the Ukraine situation is one way and not the other way, I think we've got to be careful around how we then ostracize and isolate potentially groups of children.
Yeah, it's particular, as you were saying earlier, that people do seem to rush to anger more now than perhaps they ever have. And I think maybe a collection of things more that's done online with social media now. There's that instant thing, and therefore instantly I must be angry. And you've then sometimes got to think through, exactly as you're saying, with think through what this means in a school which has got Russian children. Yeah, I think that's very true.
But but I think there's lots of elements. You look at the Black Lives Matter agenda that happened during lockdown. There's no doubt that the aim of everybody being treated equally, and the reason why the Black Lives Matter isn't saying that white lives don't matter, and getting people to understand that if you've got 4 windows in your house and the one's broken, you fix the broken one. You don't worry about the other 3. And getting communities to understand that, but actually allowing schools to have a dialogue around that isn't divisive, that isn't going to just remove some from that. That's a challenge. And schools don't need to tiptoe around things, but they do need to be very open and transparent about why they're doing things, especially around those sort of controversial potentially areas. So
we often get new governors coming to our sites and looking for that first step, because interestingly, it's the sort of first time a lot of them have gone back into school since they were there themselves. So if you were given what you know now, what would you say to a new governor? They've just started in post. What would your key guidance be?
I guess the guidance, the first thing I'd say is that they're there for all children, and that can sometimes be difficult, especially when lots of governors are linked to schools because of family links, children of themselves, or they're the granddad or whatever, and getting them to understand that they don't need to be involved in minutiae. For me, that helicopter view, that community view, being an ear for me in the community and feeding that back is enough. If they can do more than that, that's great. Do you know what I mean? But what I don't want, and I think certainly people who've not been governors before, then think that all of a sudden they've got this huge amount of responsibility and need to have the answers for those. Ofsted is the obvious one for those, isn't it? The thing that most governors fear is not Ofsted itself; it's them mucking up Ofsted for the school. That's the thing. As a governor myself, as speaking to governors, I just don't want to let anybody down, Vic. I don't want to let anybody down. I don't want to be the one that means we don't get a good, or we don't get an outstanding, or we don't whatever.
Been there, seen that, felt that exact fear. Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely.
But again, that shows how brilliant governance is if it's done in the right way, and that passion and care is there, because that's what I want to feel from my governors. I want to feel that they give as much as I do. But the reality is they're not the head. They're not education trained. They know what they know, but just be prepared. And for me, the papers are there for a reason. Read them. Okay, that's the bottom line. Somebody has taken a lot of time to do that. So listen, get into the school, make sure you read the paperwork, but don't expect to have the answers. Give yourself freedom to not have the answers as a governor, because that's not what we need.
Yeah, I think that was when I first became a governor back, probably even before you were even ahead. I think it was many years ago. That was one of the things that struck me. It was that, because I came from a sort of world of business. I know that's how I sort of saw this role, and yet it very quickly worked out there's this strategic stuff and the links with the community, and that's where governance can sit. And then there's the operational side, and you don't mix the two. And I think that is probably one of the lessons, which is quite tough for some governors to learn, because they come into the role because they care, they want to make a difference, they want to change stuff. But sometimes you've got to really realize how you can do that and how you can't.
It does come down to the questions you answer. That's, if there's nothing else, so we obviously have a governor linked to health and safety, and their background is health and safety, so they could probably come and tell us what to do, but that doesn't sustain us or them beyond their tenure as a governor. So actually use your expertise. Don't be afraid to use your expertise, but not in a telling way, it's in a questioning way. That, why have you done it that way? Okay, you can justify it, that's all I need to know. And that I think that is a massive challenge for governors, because they want to contribute.
Hey, one of the questions we got actually just before the webinar was, should governing boards have a wellbeing governor? Now, given some of the experiences you've had over recent years and perhaps before, and also perhaps an increased emphasis on the wellbeing within schools for pupil and staff, do you think that's a role? Have you got one on one of your boards?
What would that role? No, and I struggle to work out what that role is, because my well-being should be every governor's responsibility, as should the whole school. So from my perspective, I think there's elements of well-being that comes alongside mental health, obviously, and I think probably most governing bodies, either through their safeguarding or through a separate mental health kind of aspect, would there be somebody doing that. Again, forced well-being. I guess forced well-being is just not well-being. So I think you're creating a role for a governor to go say, what are you doing? Come on, let's go and do stuff. Well, no, I don't. At the moment, the last thing anybody wants me to do is stuff. They want me to do nothing because they need time. So maybe a governor for finding time would be useful, but a governor for well-being in its own right. I can't work out what that role would mean. Apart from commissioning some surveys and saying, why don't you get a yoga teacher in? For me, I think every governor has a well-being role, and I think in most cases, most governors fulfil that.
Yeah, I think there is a sort of a monitoring role there, isn't there, from the staff survey particularly. We've used one on a regular basis within RMAT, and I found that really interesting in a number of ways. One is to sort of spot changes over time, but the other is differences between schools within the MAT. So we've got six schools in our MAT, and sometimes you say, well, hang on, look, those schools are saying that, and these schools, the staff in there are saying something quite different. What does that tell us? And I think that's one of those sort of triangulation things. But I think well-being on its own, you're right.
I think it's a really tough role to have, and I think you just need to be very defined. I'm sure there are governors with well-being as their role, but the reality is what impact does that have? Is it about talking about the surveys that schools do on that and helping the school understand that? It's actually to know what that is, because from our perspective, rather than have a named governor, it's on every standing item, it's on every agenda. So well-being / mental health is on every agenda. So we talk about it to everybody, every meeting we have. These are the staff who've had office stress, or this is, that's a regular dialogue. It shouldn't feel like a bolt-on. So as long as if there is a role for that, it's not bolted onto the side of everything. It actually sits smack in the middle, because if we're not well, we're not doing a very good job. We won't do our best job.
Is that something you've introduced regularly, that agenda item, or is that it recently? Or is that something that has been there for some time?
It's sort of pandemic time onwards, really, if I'm honest. It's a reasonably, don't get me wrong, mental health has obviously been a conversation that's been going on for years, but I think the over focus from everybody on the impact of the pandemic and the impact on well-being has meant that we're all focused on it now. So it's since the pandemic, and it won't go. No matter if we don't have, the pandemic goes and everything's under control, that's a really vital conversation for me. And I'll tell you why, because recruitment and retention is my biggest challenge. So recruitment is my biggest challenge. So I have to retain. So from a strategic perspective, for governors to know how well we're looking after staff, not just how well we're monitoring them, not just how well our results are and how many sticks we're hitting them with, but actually, how do staff feel about working at this school? Well, if they feel positively, they'll stay. And if they'll stay, as long as your professional learning is right, they'll get better. Therefore, your school will get better. So for me, governor wellbeing, so mental health and wellbeing for my staff specifically is a vital strategic thing to discuss, because it means they'll stay, which means I haven't got to find an English teacher. 0.24 applicants for every role that we advertise. So it takes us 4 rounds of adverts to get 1 application in EBAC subjects. So keeping the ones we've got is really important. So it's a key strategic priority. It's not a bolt-on, and I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think every governor would absolutely recognise that, and I think it's a point where
we can't recruit our way out of teacher shortages. We can only retain our way out of it.
Yeah,
that's the bottom line.
I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. And then, okay, right. So, final question. Just to see where we've been chatting for ages. Have you noticed?
Sorry,
it's amazing. So, if a governor, particularly chair of governors, is having a conversation like this with their head teacher and thinks, okay, you're not well, what do they do? Because clearly they're not a professional counsellor. They can't do that. But are there particular places you think that a chair of governors could direct their head teacher to get help?
I think there's an element of, I think, a conversation that chairs and governing bodies generally should have around, do head teachers need supervision? I think there are some schools that provide supervision for certain members of staff. Certainly from my safeguarding team, they will have supervision, to de-stress, etc.
So that's people who they can go and have a very professional conversation with, and those are people typically outside of the schools, so perhaps from the LA or. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a conversation that should be had. I think with what support do you need from us, not necessarily directly from us. What can we help to make sure that you've got somewhere to go? I think that's massively important. But it just comes down to being honest. It's an honest. If my chair of governors had said to me, Vic, I'm just really worried about you. This is why I'm worried about you. You don't look yourself. You're grey, or you're snappy, or you're not as present, or you're. That's enough. That's enough for me. Just be honest with me and say, look, I'm worried, because actually I'll go, okay, no, you're right to be worried, or, oh, I'm sorry, I've got something else going on and you don't know about. And then that helps the dialogue. But to couch it in the chair's words, I'm worried. It's affecting me because I'm worried about you. That will automatically make me want to have a conversation with you. That will automatically make me open up, because as a caring professional, I don't want you to feel like that either.
No, it's so easy, I think, to see how head teachers get into a situation like you did, and it's very hard, I think, to see how they can easily get out of it. And I think a lot of people. I think we've had over 500 people here on the webinar this evening. I think they'll have got hopefully something out of that, both in terms of governors, how they can help their heads and their chief execs, but also I think their heads, what they can reflect on and help. So, thanks ever so much for sharing. Thanks again for your time tonight. Let's have that guilty conversation where I say thank you to you and you say thanks to the government.
Thank you to you. But seriously, there's 500 people give out another hour of their life now that's not even linked to their school directly, and they won't get the credit for. So thank you on behalf of your schools, because that's again a phenomenal thing to do. So much appreciated. And I do hope that, I know there was we waffled on too much at the beginning for some people, but I hope the conversation was at least something that gave an insight that maybe they could see triggers in their own head teachers and their own teachers for.
I think any governor listening to you would learn an awful lot.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Well, look, as Vic said, thanks ever so much for coming on tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll be sending around a feedback form. We really like to get these right, so please feedback on all those people who decide that not enough solid content right at the beginning have left already. But please do give us your feedback so we can do this better in future. We'll also be sending around a recording of this to everyone who registered. We had nearly 2,000 people who've asked for that recording. Can you believe it?
Wow.
And we'll be also
Doesn't that
sharing
highlight how worried governors are about the well-being of their colleagues, though? Doesn't that just show that? Because there's never been 2,000 people sign up for anything I've ever done before, and they're not doing that for me. They're doing it because what this topic is important to them. They can see that it might help. So, well done to you guys for focusing on it.
No, I think that's absolutely spot on. We did a survey recently, and it came out absolutely as top concern. I think for governors at the moment is in terms of particularly their head teachers' well-being. So well, thanks everybody, and we will be sharing some materials as well in the emails afterwards. But most of all, thanks to you, Vic. It was really, really great to hear you. I enjoyed that conversation immensely.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Vic.